Hello, today we're talking to David Almond. You'll know David famously for this book, Skellig. He's got a new picture book out called The Dam, and he's going to be talking about some other books in just a minute, and we'll start with some general questions. So David, welcome to my channel.
Hello Michael, it's very good to be here.
And how did you get into writing stories?
I mean, people say, when did you start writing stories? And actually I think writers are people who just never stop, because I used to write when I was a little boy, like lots of children do, and I just kept on doing it. So when I was little, when I was 7 or 8, I used to write stories on bits of paper, fold them over and turn them into little books. So I've always been writing.
And were you encouraged to do that by teachers, both at primary and secondary?
Primary school I was a bit, secondary school I wasn't at all, but schools were different then. I had an uncle who was a writer, and he was very encouraging. He was never published, none of his work was ever published, but he said, that doesn't matter, I just do it because I love it. And so he was a dedicated writer. He wrote novels, short stories, he wrote plays that were never performed. So I saw this man who wrote, and I thought, oh, I can do the same.
So you had it. I quite often think that in order to start writing, you have to have some idea that it has status, that you have some sense that it's a good thing to do. I often think about, say, the Beatles. That why did they pick up guitars and ukuleles and things? Well, their uncles and so on were in bands, weren't they?
Yeah.
And so, your uncle, you think, was
absolutely
a person who could do that?
Because, you know, the larger family, it wasn't a literary family at all. You know, there wasn't a kind of tradition of writing. But there was this one uncle who used to listen to poetry on Radio 3 and talked about writing and wanted to be a writer. He was also a printer. He used to print the local newspaper. He was the last of the Almond printers. And apparently when I was very small, I used to go into Amos's printing shop and see the printed pages coming off the rollers and go, oh, how beautiful it was. And now, you know, whenever one of my books comes out, one of the things I love is that black print on white paper.
Yes.
Yeah.
And where was all this going on?
In Felling, Gateshead.
In Gateshead, yeah, I see. And so, when did you have a sense of yourself, I have written a story that other people want to read? When have I written a novel or a short story? When did you have that sense? Was there a moment when, if you like, you kind of went through the sound barrier to that point?
I suppose all through my teenage years and when I was at university, I was writing, and all the time I thought, oh, at some point someone will read my work, even though at the back of my head was always this voice, which still exists, which says, you're the worst writer that's ever existed, and just give it all up, stop now.
That's still there, is it?
Oh,
that
yeah.
Negative voice?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's always there, that self-doubt.
Yeah, yes.
And, but then when I used to write fragments. I wrote bits of stories, bits of poems, bits of novels. And I remember the person I was living with at the time, I was lying on the floor thinking about writing. And she said to me, do you not write anymore? And I thought, well, I am writing. I'm kind of thinking about writing. And I actually got up off the floor and wrote my first ever short story that was that I finished. And then it went on to be published, so it was then. And by this time, I was in my mid-20s.
Yeah, so that was the moment. Very good. So look, we've got a big pile of books. I've brought a big pile of your books. There we are. We've got, this is your latest novel, isn't it?
Yes,
this one?
Colour of the Sun.
The Colour of the Sun. And then here we are, we've got these. We've got Jackdaw Summer. There's one of my favourites down here, Heaven Eyes. There it is, magical journey along a river in Newcastle. And some others, but what would be nice to do to talk about, you can choose, you've brought some of your own books as well, to choose a book and to talk about how the book began and how it developed. So choose any one of these, and then we'll get to kind of close quarters with it, any one that you like.
Okay, let's choose this one, the first one I say, The Tale of Angelina Brown.
Yeah, excellent.
And this began, I was sitting on a bus one day and I was looking at the bus driver, and the bus driver looked really fed up. He'd obviously been, and I thought we'd probably been driving the same journey for years, back and forward on the same bus, doing the same journey. And he looked really fed up, and I just knew I had to write about him. So I began to write a story about a bus driver on a bus street and really fed up. And then suddenly as I was writing it, I wrote about something happening in his top pocket, and I didn't know what was happening in his top pocket, but I knew there was something happening, and he thought it was... He thought he was having a heart attack, but it turned out he wasn't having a heart attack. And the thing that he found in his top pocket was the thing that generated this whole book, The Tale of Angelina Brown.
Right, so just from seeing a bus driver, that got you thinking where did the child come into that? You know, quite often if we write books for children, you know, we're sort of quite often thinking about children. You're looking at a bus driver who's fed up. It's a very kind of adult world. So when did you make the change into the child?
One of the things that he was really fed up about was he had to pick up children. So he's driving through the town, he's really fed up, he's been driving the same bus to the same route all these years. And the worst thing are the children that come on, because they're full of life and energy, you know, and they sort of sing songs and stuff, and they say, start the bus, I want to away with it. And Bert is just totally fed up with that. And there's a little girl who comes and says, what's that in your top pocket?
Ah, she's the one who spots it.
She spots it, yes.
Ah, yes.
And then the thing that's in his pocket turns out to be a small angel child. Yes.
Ah, nice.
So it's like the child, there's a kind of child creature in his pocket, but also it draws him into a whole world of children. And his wife is a school dinner lady, so she has lots of contact with the children. So the children in the school become really important in the story.
And how did you decide how to tell it? Whose voice? You know, as writers, we can decide to say I.
Yeah.
You know, if you think of Diary of a Wimpy Kid.
Yeah.
All right. Or we can be the narrator who can see everything going on. So it's kind of the author, but it isn't really. It's this special person who can be up the mountain, down the coal mine, on a boat, and go anywhere, everywhere.
Yeah.
So how did you decide that voice? Because that's sometimes very hard, particularly for children when they're writing, to decide who that is.
That's really, because most of my early books were all written from the first person. So the narrator is the person who tells the story and it's their tale. But then when I began to write a different kind of book, maybe illustrated books, which I've done quite a lot of now, it was like when I began to do those, I began to write in the third person. And there was something about writing in the third person that gave me a kind of distance, which I really liked. And it also enabled me to be funny, which I was really surprised. Oh, writing in the third person, you can be funny. It was really interesting, whereas, you know, a lot of my early books like Skellig or Kit's Wilderness, and some of them still do the same thing. It's one voice, it can get quite, they're not deeply inward, but it's to do with the consciousness of the narrator. But when you write a book in the third person about a bus driver and an angel and some children, having that distance gives you kind of permission to, in my case, be funny.
And how do you decide whether you can go only into one person's head or lots of people's heads? Because if you go through one person's head, then it's that person's view only.
Yeah.
And if you hop about, which is fine, it's a kind of wider view. So, you know, we can go all the way back to somebody like Charles Dickens. He was in lots of people's heads.
Yeah.
But sometimes in books, you're just really looking through, though it's not I, it's he or she, you're looking through that person's eyes. How do you decide, and what did you do with this book?
You can't go into too many heads. If you try and go into too many heads, it's, you know, you kind of just get, you lose, I can't anyway, you lose track. So I think what you have to do is to show what people do and what they say. So they demonstrate who they are, how they feel, by what they do and what they say. And I think that's important anyway, even when you're writing in the first person, because if you try and describe exactly how somebody feels, it's kind of impossible. You don't know. The words we have for emotions are very vague, and you know, we'll have words like angry or sad or cheesed off, but they're very kind of vague. So how do you really know how somebody feels? It's by what they do or what they say, how they interact with other people and how they interact with the world. So in it's a story like The Tale of Angelina Brown, there are lots of children in it. There's a bus driver, there's a bus driver's wife, there are other teachers, there's a government advisor who tells people how to teach writing, things like that. And but you can only say how they feel and what they believe by the things that they say. Right.
So it's quite an emphasis on dialogue and getting that right.
Yeah.
And on dialogue, how do you get that right? Are you a listener? Are you a watcher and listener, and you catch bits of dialogue on buses and steal that?
I guess I must be, but I'm not one of those writers who sits and listens and tries to catch interesting fragments of dialogue. I suppose all the time, as a writer, you're kind of absorbing stuff all the time. So all the time I'm walking around, I'm taking in people's voices, and I think it's the kind of rhythms of people's voices that get into me. It's a kind of the music of just walking around in the world. You know, the music of how people speak, what they say, how they laugh, as well as the music of all of the sounds. But for me, dialogue is central, and I take a lot of time, a lot of pain to make sure that the dialogue seems authentic, but is also in some way rhythmical and beautiful, whether it's kind of however dark or however funny it might be. You try and make it kind of beautiful.
And do you make notes? Are you making notes as you're going about? Do you make notes at home? Are you a notebook maker?
Notebooks to me are everything. So the thing about a book is when it's finished, it looks perfect, and people take this off the shelf and say, "Oh, look at that David Almond! Look how tidy he is! Look how neat his mind is." Now, I remember when I was a teenager, a young person in Felling, and going to the library, which I loved. Looking at that, I thought that's what I want to do, but it looks impossible. I thought I'll never be able to do that.
Yes.
But books come from a very imperfect place, from the human mind, and we are imperfect. And I think imperfection is the thing that makes us creative. So my books start in notebooks, and I use artist sketchbooks. I love artist sketchbooks, big, blank, A4 pages.
Show that to the camera. Show that on this one.
And it looks kind of messy, but what it is, it's a kind of exploration. And I use colouring pencils.
So let's have a look here. You've got a landscape here with a bridge, a river, a field, and then what are you writing on to the landscape?
Yeah, so these are the notes for the book called The Colour of the Sun, which is that one. So this is the kind of beginning to outline a chapter. So because it happens on a green field with a river running below, the sun above and hills above, I find it really liberating and kind of fascinating to almost draw the landscape that the story is going to take place in, even though it's a kind of very elemental kind of drawing. And then if I can visualize it, because the imagination is about seeing things, so I try and see where it takes place and then begin to put fragments of the story that might be in. So what have I got here? The mist hanging in the air. Up here there are, when I was doing this, I thought there's probably starlings, a murmuration of starlings. And I found drawing the murmuration of starlings was really helpful in the act of imagining.
Here though you've got, he didn't die. Read us that bit.
Yeah, he didn't die. What kind of doctor can't tell if a kid's alive or dead? Yeah, so this is, in the story, there's a boy who seems to be dead. But the first line of the story is he didn't die. So then somebody's saying, he didn't die. What kind of doctor can't tell if a lad's alive or dead? You're not getting me to go to see him again. So it's like when I was drawing this, and it's kind of, it's a weird kind of meditation or relaxation. You do this, you draw it, and I think, oh yeah, somebody's going to say that. And actually in the novel they don't say that, they say something else. But it released that as a kind of distraction in some ways. So on the one hand, it kind of focuses your attention on what you're doing. But because you're playing around with pens and pencils and highlighters, it kind of frees things to come to the surface. So I think it kind of allows the subconscious to come into operation.
You know what it reminds me of a bit? The willow pattern plate.
Yeah,
now, I know the willow pattern plate tells a story.
Yes.
But the idea of a bridge and people in one place and going to another, and that you can express in a drawing different times in the same drawing. Yes. So the willow pattern is could be across a year or more. Yeah. That story, you can do that in a picture with your words or the images. That's so, as you say, liberating. That's wonderful. I've never seen that before.
And for me, this is the purpose of notebooks, and especially working on blank pages, because a book is linear, and I think because a book's linear, people think, how should you write a book? They think, well, you write in straight lines, you write from beginning to middle to end. But my mind doesn't work like that. I can't do that. And I think the mind is spontaneous and generates lots of stuff all at the same time. And this kind of playful messing about process for me.
Show that one. Like that. Yeah. What's that? It looks like a carpet. What is that?
When I was doing this, I was just kind of meditating and, getting myself into a kind of trance with me coloured pencils.
I like that.
There's a kind of, and here this is, a street of houses. There's a car, because this car comes into it. The sun again, it's called The Colour of the novel's called The Colour of the Sun. There's some swings parks, some kids playing on swings.
You've got never go there. danger.
Never go there. Smoke from chimneys, even today, because it's a hot day, they're still smoking spuds and smoke. He's got coloured pencils, so the boy in the story who's telling who the story's about is carrying a tin of coloured pencils, a bit like my coloured pencils. A totem pole. Yeah, when I was doing this, and I was doing this as field of houses, then a grassy verge, a place on a housing estate. And then when I was doing that, I thought they've got a totem pole. So you kind of see the totem. Oh yes, they've got a totem pole. So there's a kind of drawing of a kind of very basic totem pole, and the totem pole becomes very important in the story. But I didn't know it was going to be there until I drew that green patch. I thought, oh yeah, there's a totem pole in there.
And in your books, I've noticed you're very keen on showing and expressing the fact that your characters, particularly the child characters, have this huge territory of imagination.
Yeah.
That this seems to be very important to you, to say that these children, they might look very ordinary, leading the most ordinary of lives, and we don't like the word ordinary anyway, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But behind it, so I think of Heaven Eyes and Skellig, for example, there's this huge area of what people are imagining might be, could be, they hope for, and all that. Is that, would that be fair to say?
Absolutely, and this book, Colour of the Sun, which came out earlier this year, which this is the notebook for, that's exactly what that's about. It's about a boy walking through a landscape, the landscape of my hometown. He sets off in the morning, he spends the whole day wandering about, and then he comes home again. And during that whole day of exploration, he's like exploring the world and finding lots of stuff about the world and meeting lots of people who tell him lots of fascinating things and interacting with kids and with adults and with animals. And he has this kind of moment of kind of transformation. And it all takes place in a very ordinary little town. But he's exploring the world, but he's also exploring himself. He's exploring his own kind of potential, his own possibilities, his own kind of, that vastness of the human mind.
And how do you, when you're writing something like that, do you find the need that you have a narrative that's in the present, do you have to go backwards and forwards in time in order to, if you like, make the narrative what sometimes people call thick?
Yeah.
It's a narrative that is and then is thin, and then in order to fill in more, you go backwards and forwards in time. Do you do that?
I suppose I do. When I'm writing, I always, even though I might know what's going to happen sort of 30 pages on, I'll not actually write that, I'll just have a bit of it. So I'm always writing in a linear fashion from the beginning. But there'll be moments when you draw in elements from the past. So like when Davy in The Colour of the Sun is moving through the town, and it's all happening, it happens all in the present tense and actually in the third person, which gave me a new kind of liberation. He keeps drawing in things from the past, and they almost kind of come and get him, which is the way the past does, doesn't it? Your memory, it's not like you say, I'm going to try and remember something. You're just going through your day and suddenly, oh yeah, I remember that. And what is it that makes you remember those things?
Yes, catches you.
Yeah.
Yes. And as you're writing, do you have a sense that sometimes you have to do special things to keep someone reading? That's to put it very crudely, but it's the idea that you might need mysteries or question marks, or you may think you know about this but you don't. Do you think about how, I mean, you could call them hooks, things that sort of drag you through a story because you want the reader wants to know more?
Yeah, you do, and
can you think of one? Can you think of something that you might do that, it may be a tease almost, you know, where you...
I think a lot of it's to do with timing, and especially like my novels, all of my novels I think are just very short chapters, a series of very short chapters. So I'm aware when I'm writing my chapter that I'll stop a chapter at a moment when somebody needs to know what's going to happen next. They want to know what's going to happen next. So it's almost like the chapter in itself is a kind of complete thing, but it's not totally complete because you want to read on.
So you cut it short and you go, well, what's going to happen next then?
Yeah.
Why isn't he telling us?
Yeah.
We better find out.
That's right.
There's a bit of that.
Yeah. And sometimes you do it like in a very obvious way, like the first sentence of The Colour of the Sun is, and it's a huge, I suppose, hook right at the start. It's an ordinary summer day, the day that Jimmy Killen dies and comes to life again. So you
What do you mean he comes to life again? How dare you?
So in the first sentence you're saying this is going to happen.
Yes.
But then I didn't touch that again for ages. But that kind of lingers. So I suppose you become conscious of leaving things to linger in the reader's mind.
Yes.
Without them thinking, oh, what's happening? But you
when are we going to get back to that as well? You can always think that when you're reading, can't you?
Yeah.
Yes. And then, do you ever, all right, and this is nothing to be ashamed of, because, we often think about this, as you're writing, do you ever think, oh, I'm borrowing this little bit from that Greek myth or that Shakespeare story or that?
Yeah.
Give us an idea of how that works. How might you do that?
Talking about Greek myths, I wrote a book a few years ago called A Song for Ella Grey, which is Orpheus and Eurydice transferred to Tyneside. So it's set among Tyneside teenagers. So it's the story of Orpheus and Eurydice happening in Tyneside today. And one of the important things about the old stories, they're old and they're retold because they're so powerful. And they drive us to tell them again and again and again and again. So right from the start, I knew this was my version of Orpheus and Eurydice. And in my story, Eurydice is called Ella. She's a sixth form lass. She meets Orpheus on Bamborough Beach, falls in love with him, he falls in love with her. And they're doomed, because most people know the story. But even when people don't know the story, you say, she meets this figure, Orpheus on Bamborough Beach, she falls in love with, he falls in love with her. He's a kind of mythical figure. And you ask them what's going to happen. They say, she's going to die. So there's something about the old stories that have to be told and retold. So I think, a book looks like an individual object on its own. There it is in the air. But any book is filled with other books. It's bound to be. It's like people. People are individuals, but they're filled with all kinds of other people. So I'm very proud of the fact that a lot of my books contain influences from other books. And I think that's really important for young writers. Originality isn't making something that's entirely unlike anything that's ever been before. Originality is your own words, your own story told in your way, but it's bound to be influenced by all stories that have been told.
And it's perfectly okay to grab a bit. You suddenly remember a moment, I don't know, let's say it's when Miranda in The Tempest suddenly sees human beings for the first time and says, oh, brave new world that hath such people in it. And you're thinking, no, they're all a bunch of pretty rotten guys, actually.
That's right.
So there's, and you could sort of think, well, that could work in a modern time in somewhere or another in which a person, I don't know, landed up at a party and said, wow, what lovely people. And we already knew they were horrible.
Yeah.
And that's perfectly all right. You think, to kind of, as it were,
absolutely
nick those things.
In that exact example in Heaven Eyes, when the children climb up, they get off the raft, and I knew something was going to happen. I wasn't sure quite what was going to happen, but I knew it was influenced by the Tempest. And they come off the raft, and I wrote this about 4 or 5 times. Come on, something happened. And then suddenly Heaven Eyes comes and taps them on the shoulder and says, are you my sister? And it's a Miranda moment, yes. Where have you come from? What an amazing world that you exist in it as well as me. I'm getting shivers up my spine because of the power of such a moment. And it's a kind of, it's almost an elemental thing in stories, isn't it? That suddenly something comes out of the blue and says, are you that? And is the world like that? And I think keeping on doing that's what stories are, yeah.
Right, let's take a little shift now and imagine that you've got in front of you a group of children. They could be any age you like, and some teachers, and we're going to do some writing. Okay, what sort of advice? Where would you start? What are we going to do?
I think the first thing to do is I always show my notebooks and say, look at that, look at the mess I make.
It's disgusting.
It's disgusting, and I take that into schools and I say, oh, this is what I do, and I go like that, and the children go, oh, and then they look at the teacher and say, oh,
it's untidy. They're scribbling out.
That's
spelling
right.
mistakes.
Yeah. So I go and I say, it doesn't matter. This is writing that doesn't matter. Because the thing about schools is, I'm a great admirer of schools and teachers. I think schools and teachers are amazing these days. Some wonderful teachers and, of course, wonderful children. But there's this tendency in school to think everything has to be read, everything has to be recorded, everything has to be commented on. And nobody comes and looks at my work when I'm doing it. It's secret. So I think you have to, I say, well, use a notebook, get a notebook. Your work doesn't matter. And then I do some very quick things, because I think as well, like the imagination, we think the imagination must be very slow and very difficult. But actually the imagination is spontaneous and fast. So I'll say, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'm going to ask them really fast. You've only got a minute to answer them. So you haven't got time to think of something clever, but you've got to write an answer. And then I'll ask them a question like, why did Mrs. Askew sit in that puddle last week? I say, you've only got a minute. So you've got to answer it. You can't leave a space, and you can't say, I don't know. And the kind of liberation, okay, so they scribble down an answer. And then you ask them another question, say, well, there's a dog called Patch that wrote a book. What's Patch's book called? You've only got a minute to answer. Come on, write the answer. So it's a kind of match between pressure and total lack of pressure. Because you've got to do this, but it really doesn't matter.
Right, so it's a spark.
Yeah.
Like a fun, sparky thing.
Yeah.
And see if you can think of something. It is. So you've got Patch, you've got Mrs. Askew, you've got these characters, and you're just inventing a little situation and going, well, why?
Yeah, yeah.
So the why is quite important, isn't it?
Yeah. So, and you ask that question, you've got to answer it. You write down the answer, and as soon as people get into that, you think, oh yeah, I can do this. And when you do it, you see people going, oh, I can do this.
Yes.
And suddenly, and I say, you've got to do this. You've got 10 questions to answer. And suddenly people say, oh yeah, I've got to do it. So they start writing down the answers. And there's a kind of way of relaxing. It sounds like pressuring, but it's kind of relaxing. And it's also a way of demonstrating that we're filled with these things. We're filled with these stories, filled with stories about Mrs. Askew. And then you say, so Mrs. Askew, she sat in a puddle. Let's think about Mrs. Askew. When Mrs. Askew was 7, she had a dog. What was the dog called? And people go, oh yeah, the dog was called, and people know the answers. And it's weird, I think, because we know how stories work. That's what we are. And I think one of the problems with a lot of the way we talk about writing is we make it seem difficult. Make it seem almost inhuman. But we are human beings. That's what we do. We tell stories. And as soon as you allow people to find the stories inside themselves, they'll write down these things. Oh, where did that come from? Oh, it came from me. And that is a really momentous thing for children to discover.
So your 10 questions, are they connected in your mind, or are they quite random and the children pull them together?
They're just random, totally disconnected.
Why did the train break down?
Yeah.
The man's shirt had a hole in it.
Yeah.
Why was there a hole in it?
That's right. What did Joe see when he opened the cupboard? What was written on the back of the door when Joe opened the cupboard?
Like that. Yeah. Yes.
So they'd be totally disconnected. I mean, you can connect them, but then you do this, and what it does, it shows the multitude of stuff that you can do.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they make the connections.
They make the connections if they want to. So that'll just be like, I'll do that as a quick exercise. Then maybe move on to something slower. And once you've got people engaged like that, then it's almost like they realise they can do anything. And I've never found anybody anywhere in the world who can't do it. It's really interesting, because people say the imagination is really hard, and they'll say to children, you've got no imagination. But when you do this, you find out, yeah, it's easy. It's kind of weirdly easy.
And what would you say that if you wanted to create a classroom, that working environment of a classroom, into what I might call a writing-friendly classroom, or with a writing-friendly atmosphere, what things would you say would most contribute to that?
Notebooks, lots of notebooks. Secret writing, lots of reading, lots of reading aloud. I think reading aloud is really important. And also another interesting thing is to get children to read out the sentences that they're writing. Because if you can read a sentence, okay, it probably means the sentence is all right. If you find a sentence difficult to read, it's probably there's something wrong with it. Sing the sentences. And I think it's really interesting to see writing as a physical thing, and I think we often think writing is just to do with the brain, but I think the brain is to do with the body. Think about how you first learn to read and write. You do it with your body, You're in reception class, you're moving a pen across paper, chalk across a slate, puts you in the past, that kind of thing. And so it's a physical thing, and singing stories or dancing stories or acting out stories. And I think the relationship between physical movement and the movement of the pen on the page and the movement of stories, I think is really important. So I think it's important to see it as it's a kind of art, but isn't just to do with the brain. So it's a mixture of all these kind of activities.
So I was looking at your new picture book, The Dam.
Yeah.
And this is based on a memory by the Northumbrian musician. Catherine Tickell,
Yeah.
yes?
Yeah.
But I was immediately struck by the rhythm. Here we've got a picture, I don't know whether you can see that there, and you're talking about this idea of the rhythm. You just read us this page here, just a sense of, so we get a sense of the rhythm that you're talking about and the movement, or you can pick another page if you like, because I was very struck by that in this book.
The music rises, it continues. We hear it in the birds and in the waves and in the leaves and in the grass. We hear it when we're nearby, when we are far away, when we remember, when we dream.
Brilliant. So you've got the beat there that's
Yeah.
pulling you through
Yeah.
it, and of course it's also in your the writing in your other stories. Well, that's wonderful, David. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Michael.
It's been
Thank you.
lovely talking to you.
Cheers, thank you.